Me now to help break it all down. Fox News political contributor Tammy Bruce, also Independent Women's Voice president. Gina Loudon, Donald J. Trump for President Inc. Advisory Board, and Gail Trotter, attorney and contributor at The Hill. Here's the thing, Tammy. Last August, Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Trade Representative, initiated what they call a Section 301 investigation into China's trade practices, which we all know have been egregiously unfair.
Right.
He came up apparently with the idea of leveling $30 billion in sanctions and tariffs against them. Apparently, President Trump wants $60 billion. The stakes are obviously high. But the question is, if we don't do it now, then when do we ever push back on this?
Yeah, and look, with President Trump, it's a very different dynamic, I think, than with any other president, where you would have a distinct decision made and penalties or tariffs in place. President Trump sees everything as a negotiation. We know that we want things to be fair. What he said in Oslo at that meeting was he wants America first, but not America alone. And so he knows what the problems might be. And there could be, of course, some pushback, even though China is the worst offender. Look, we've made this world an interactive world for a reason. We thought that being more involved with us would tame them a little bit, whereas, in fact, we've ended up being the can that everyone kicks on the road. So for us, I think, and for President Trump, what we have to realize is that while these things might sound frightening at first, or what we need to do to become to have the environment be more fair, is that it's going to be less of a dramatic kind of slap against any country, even China, but the negotiation for what is going to be good for both countries, right, but certainly better for us, so that it is a fair framework. And that, I think, is not what people are thinking right now. They're not anticipating that, and they should. Well, certainly the stock market may not be anticipating that, Gina, but here's the deal. President Trump is saying, listen, we just can't continue to have a relationship where it's a 350 billion annual trade deficit. That's not a true fair trade relationship. It's not symbiotic. It's obviously all of the wealth is leaving our country. And while Wall Street may applaud the money coming back in ownership of hotels like the Waldorf Astoria, I think President Trump thinks that's a bad deal.
You know, I've studied most of my life. I've studied business psychology, Charles, and I can tell you that so much of negotiations, as every business person who's done a negotiation knows, is about the psychology of it. And there's a lot of that going on here. Now, I'm not saying that Trump is playing some kind of head games, because I really don't think that's what he does. I think what he does is he makes very educated calculations. And so far, at least to date, his track record is pretty darn good, not just in the private sector, but also as president, accomplishing more than really any other president we've seen in recent history, if ever. And so I think we kind of have to trust the instincts of Trump and, to quote some good people, let Trump be Trump, because I think that's what he does best, and that's why people elected this business leader.
And I think everyone, Gail, agrees that China has been a serious offender, and they've gotten over in this relationship to the degree where it's unsustainable, at least from our point of view. I should let the audience know China's GDP for last year finally came in this morning, 6.9%, the first year-over-year increase since 2010. Industrial production for the first 2 months of this year, 7.2%. The Street thought it would be 5.9%. Xi has become an emperor. He's consolidating all of their agencies. He's empowering their central bank. He is preparing for an economic war, while people in this country are cowering at the thought of somehow China punishing us. They sold us $500 billion worth of stuff. Who else would they sell that to, Gail?
That's right. Well, the question becomes, who is going to blink? And President Trump is not the blinking type. Now, Dr. Gina has the psychology of business. I can talk to you about the legal strategy. There are significant legal countermeasures that President Trump can take if China decides to retaliate against Boeing or any of the other U.S. companies that are selling products into China. There's a pending U.S. intellectual property investigation going on right now, and China's investments in the United States could be restricted by U.S. regulators. Their access to U.S. capital markets could be restricted. This is not the only thing that President Trump can do in terms of the tariffs. There are other additional measures that can be taken by the U.S. And President Trump is not going to blink on this. You know, and we should point out that by some estimates, China's theft of intellectual trade is up to $600 billion annually. I want to bring in Shaw Galani, Capital Wave forecast editor. Shaw,
Wall Street, their reaction to this, okay, I thought the reaction to potential tariffs on steel and aluminum was over the top. I thought it was a negotiating thing from the very beginning and would not necessarily include Canada and Mexico. We can no longer afford to look the other way. And I will acknowledge Boeing was hammered today, in part because it's estimated they're going to sell China over $1 trillion worth of planes in the next 2 decades. We want to see that happen, but by the same token, we are looking for some semblance of fair trade.
Well, I agree. We were looking for that. I don't know we're going to get that, Charles, because what's happened is that I think investors thought this was going to be a shot across the bow and things would move on. But this is not. The president has campaigned on fighting trade against illegal and improper trade against the Chinese, against the Americans. That China last year had a $375 billion record trade surplus with the United States. The intellectual property theft, the technology transfer that the Chinese require of U.S. firms doing business there. These are all problems that President Trump campaigned on. And so the fact that he's bringing these up now, the fact that this shot across the bow with steel and aluminum, shook investors, is now rattling down to the fact that this isn't just saber rattling. This is actually probably going to turn into some kind of war.
It is going to probably turn into some kind of war. And here's the thing, Tammy, I polled folks all throughout the campaign and said, listen, you know that if President Trump lives up to his promises, that will mean perhaps that TV that you bought that we imported from China, it's going to cost a few extra bucks. Mm-hmm. People continue to tell me, and they told me then and they tell me now, they're willing to do that. They see this as a patriotic duty to pay a few extra bucks as we bring manufacturing back. But again, the elites, GOP elites, Wall Street elites, they're screaming at the top of their lungs, and they're trying to frighten people into the status quo.
Well, obviously, the swamp is the swamp for a reason. They get some things by the way that the status quo operates. It's been for a few generations now. They know what to expect. There's a lot of money. There's lobbying. There's trips. There's this global world that they thought was going to unfold. That has changed. And also, we have to consider whether or not China's been delivering on the issue of North Korea, the fact that the world seems to be preparing for war. And I think that these are very smart things to be able to get in order at this point. But Americans are smart. We know what this argument is. They can watch this program, Fox Business, learn what these things are about. And they know that, yes, and they've stated, we're for the sake of America and for the future of the world. Americans have always sacrificed to a degree. What we're going to ask them to do again is to do just that, but for in the long run, for a stronger and better America.
And Gina, it would seem to me that if members of President Trump's own party and others sort of understood that, it would make it even easier for him to come from a strong negotiating point of view.
Yeah, and I always want to say to these people that are so concerned about a trade war, am I in the twilight zone, Charles, or are we already in a trade war when things are so stacked against us in our trade? To me, you can call it a war as long as it's being exacted on on anyone else. But if it's being exacted on the U.S., we're not supposed to call it a trade war. I don't know. But you're right. I think if the GOP would get in line with this and start backing the president up on this, we'd start to see results even faster than when the president seems to have to do all this solo.
Yeah, $170 billion deficit with the EU, $71 billion deficit with Mexico, $370 billion deficit with China. Something ain't right. Guys, thank you all very